So kind of like I mentioned earlier, like a lot of my patients are like older, like very low, if any, training history. And a lot of them, because it's like upper body, lower body, it's almost like I do a split because most of them I see twice a week. So like maybe the first half of the week, I spent a lot of time really emphasizing like lower body, like glutes, quads, squats, lunges, like those kind of patterns. Really try to get that stimulus to the lower body. And when I see them like 2 days later, then it might be more the upper body, so more like scapular stabilizers, like some sort of overhead motion, like horizontal pulling, vertical pulling, something like that. So then it kind of gives like the front half, like the lower body, a little bit of a break. Because a lot of them aren't really, I don't want to say deconditioned, but they just don't have a lot of training experience. And kind of like I mentioned earlier, like some is better than nothing. And if they're really untrained, like just giving them enough to like where they feel like they're working one day, and you give them like another session where they feel like they're working like different areas, I think has been helpful. The only difficulty I have is trying to get people to feel like they're working, because sometimes, again, either with the pain or they find it too difficult and they don't want to do it. That's kind of like the challenge I find. But like I've been having success trying to like break it up more as like a training split. And I think at least for my population, I feel like that's worked pretty well.
Yeah, I agree. And it also gives them different things to look forward to, right? Because they don't like, I mean, Jacob said this is like you want to avoid giving them a flow sheet where they're just doing the same thing every day, right? Like people catch on very quickly, like this is not novel, this is not necessarily skilled if all you do is you're checking the box and doing the same thing, but not making any sort of progression, whether that progression is in weight or some kind of intensity or repetition or changing the dosage. If you're doing those things, then that's a change, right? But if you're doing 3 sets of 10 of the same weight, the same tempo, the same exercise, and you're doing that week in and week out, like, is that promoting an adaptation? Like, that's kind of the point of diminishing returns, right? Anybody else have thoughts on that? And then I can expand.
I was gonna say that like I've gone through a lot of the same feelings. Like I constantly feel like, oh, I'm gonna have to like make them see a reason to continue coming back. And if we do the same things, I feel like they're not getting that. I do, but I've also like kind of thought the opposite. And I feel like you just said, doing the same thing but changing like weight tempo allows them to also see like how they're adapting over time. Like if you're like, the last time, the pink was easy, but let's try the blue today. And it allows them to see like, oh, I'm getting stronger. Like, last week I couldn't even do the pink kettlebell. So I'm kind of like stuck in the middle as well. Like I feel like when I have one-on-one time with patients, I do try to change things up, but I think also progressing old things in terms of the same exercise but different weight or tempo is also important.
Yeah, I love that. Sally, Jim, any thoughts there?
I was gonna say, I guess I had to hop in too. I think along your point, I feel like I feel that same thing sometimes, but I think sometimes we're changing it because we feel like it needs to be changed, and I think communication is key too, because we might think, "Wow, this is getting really stale," but the patient like doesn't think that at all. So I guess you want to make sure that they're like keyed into it as well. Like, hey, does anything feel like you're like, or are you able to do some of this stuff at home, and maybe we can try to focus on other things, or if there's like something depending on what you're working with the person for, like if there's like some like non-negotiable thing, say, okay, well, we're going to keep these same whatever 4 exercises, but then like all the accessory stuff try to make like quote unquote more fun, or like just switch it up, like switch up that stuff a little bit more, so it's not like the same session to session, but like still your key things are the same and you can keep working on progressing those things, but it just doesn't get old as quickly.
Yeah, well, one of my mentors, it was actually Anthony. When I was his student, he made a great point. Like there was one day, like for whatever reason, our caseload was all like very similar presentations. So we were doing like the same exercises with like 5 or 6 people in a row. And he made a great point. Like I just kind of pointed out, I was like, we just did that with the last 5 people. And he's like, yeah, like we do this literally like 10 times a day. But the person we were working with had only done this like twice in their life. So from that standpoint, like we forget that we do this shit all the time. But for a lot of the people we work with, if they do it 4, 5, 6, 7 times, they're still learning the movement, right? Like this is still new to them. So like I like your point of like kind of ask them like, is this challenging? How do you feel with this? Like, would you like me to make this harder? Like just have that open line of communication. Because sometimes we forget like this is our job. Like we should be good at this. But sometimes you don't need to add novelty just for the sake of novelty, because a person might not need it. Like they might be perfectly capable of just continuing doing what they're doing and they will get better. Sally, we're gonna add on top of that.
Yeah, I think for me, I will prioritize the things they can't do at home. So a lot of people, my home program is stuff they can take and do anywhere, right? They just need a band, or, I try to do things with especially a low amount of equipment. I think it depends on your clientele, absolutely. But doing things in the clinic that they can't do at home, or you want eyes on specifically, and leave the rest for home, that at least gives me probably a handful of things that I can at least start with, right? Like, or I just introduced something that I'm definitely doing it. So if they need more cueing or more, if you're doing balance stuff, I don't really want them doing hard balance stuff at home, because I don't, safety is an issue. So it's just prioritizing, like, what can they do at home? That's kind of how I look at it, because I feel like I definitely struggle with the novelty thing, like everyone's talking about. Like, I'm like, God, I'm telling you to do squats for the 50th time, but they love it. They're like, this is great. And I'm like, God, yeah, this must be boring, but it's really not. I think we all kind of probably feel that a little bit.
Yeah. And like to expand on that just a little bit, like, you can give someone a squat a million different ways. Like, sometimes novelty is as simple as, like, you're doing the exact same movement with the same stance and the same tempo, but all we're doing is, instead of holding one kettlebell, now you're holding two kettlebells. Or instead of two kettlebells, we're going to do it with a safety squat bar. Or we're going to do like you can change the variation of the loading parameters so many different ways that it's become a new task, right? Like, I think sometimes we get caught up in the fact, like, oh, it's a squat, but it's like, if I give you a 3-second eccentric squat and then have you stand up as fast as you can, that's very, very different than if it's just like a slow, lower, slow raise, slow, lower, slow raise. Like, that's the movement parameters are the same, but the force generation and like the tissues involved act very differently in those two different situations. So going back to adaptation, you're driving two different adaptations. It's like, it's kind of like, you can get lost in the minutia, but it's also like, you have so many ways to adapt these things to make it not only interesting, but also to drive intent. So I think that's a great way to look at it. And like, to kind of like overarching view, like, I look at this as like constancy through change. So there's certain things in most of my sessions that I will keep very regimented from, like, I'm not going to change, like, let's take something as simple as like a trap bar deadlift. If I've spent the time to teach somebody how to trap bar deadlift, I'm probably going to use that movement as a way to increase overall maximal strength capacities, because I can overload that movement a lot more than I can do like a kettlebell deadlift or an RDL or something like that. So if my goal is like, I want to give this person like a large stimulus and the ability to produce a lot of force in a short period of time, something like a heavy squat or a trap bar deadlift, assuming it's safely done, is going to be a really good way to do that. But in order to actually increase their physiological capabilities, I need to make sure I'm giving them the same movement with a high intent most sessions that we're doing that. So like, if I'm going to order my session, I will do like my warm up, maybe turf stuff, whatever locomotor, like new learning type stuff for that day. And then when they're still fresh, I will do like my heavy lift type stuff or my explosive stuff. So in that case, it's like your trap bar deadlift will be fairly similar from like an execution standpoint. All I'm going to do over time is I'm going to increase the volume and hopefully increase the weight, because then what we're doing is we have enough frequent exposures that they're going to get better at it, but they're also going to hopefully get some adaptations. But to all of your point, like, how can we add novelty to that? It's like, well, later in the session, I just mix up my accessory work, right? I keep like the big rocks early in the session and they know what to expect, but I give them some kind of novelty, or I make other types of exercises more challenging throughout the rest of the session. Or I just change the sets and reps of the movement that they were doing before. It's like, all right, you can do 3x10, 4x10, 3x8, 4x8, 3x6, like, you can gradually build up the rep schemes that way. So they're always feeling like you're changing something for a particular reason, right? And oftentimes that's enough for them to get buy-in, just because they know, like, even if you don't explain it, it's like, oh, well, the weight is getting heavier and this is feeling tougher, but I'm still able to move it with the same velocity. Like, those are all good parameters, right?
If you don't mind me jumping in too real quick, one of the things we talked a little bit with that learning hierarchy, like the competency side of things, you want to get them to an unconscious competence. So I can perform this task no matter what I'm doing. So keep in mind that phase 4 of rehab, it's non-context dependent. So I can be in any context and I can do the movement proficiently, and I can do it correctly. I don't know, correctly is not the right word, but efficiently and safely. So if you're mixing up, giving a little bit of novelty, yes, they've done the loading to progress, and then you're using the novelties to say context is not going to matter how I perform this. I'm going to do well no matter what is happening around me, what type of movement it is, or what variation of squat it is, I've got the pattern down, hinges, whatever. So kind of that ecological training, making sure that you have that whole concept of no matter what the context, I'm competent. So just keeping that in mind too. Novelty is helpful neurologically that way.
And the one little thing I'll expand on that too is like novelty is helpful because it keeps people engaged, right? The last thing you want to do is have the person you're working with be bored or not feel like they're actually achieving something. So like to go back to like the whole point of training, like we're trying to drive adaptations, but how do we drive adaptations without intent? If someone is not working to some appreciable amount of difficulty, the body is not going to change, right? Like we talked about that earlier, like how much effort does it take to add a pound of muscle mass? That is a lot of effort. And the only way to do that is to kind of push that threshold to disrupt homeostasis and make your body change. So it kind of goes back to that question of like, if every session the person isn't really like, either they don't feel like they're working hard or they're not seeing incremental increases in their numbers, you might not be driving true like structural adaptations. They might be getting a little bit more comfortable neurologically, like some of the stuff Corey just talked about, but that might be an indicator like, okay, we need to find other ways to drive intensity. And for some people, it might not be load. Like you don't just need to give people heavier weights. Like what are other ways that we can drive intensity or drive intent with our exercise execution? Like what are things that you guys typically do? Say your limit, like the heaviest weight you have is a 25-pound kettlebell. How can you make somebody generate more force?
Tempo.
Who wants to go first? Jacob, go first.
I'll always go default to like stance, tempo. Those are my usual go-to.
Is that what you're going to say, Sally?
Yeah, tempo, also like rest time and amount of reps as well.
Yeah, so that's a great point. Like rest time is one that we often forget about. So if we want to drive, say we're talking about hypertrophy, right? If we're talking about like a mid-stage ACL, like somebody who doesn't really have any quad inhibition, one of the best ways to drive hypertrophy is to drive a large metabolic load. The only way we do that, or one of the ways we do that, is by eliciting a lot of fatigue and working under fatigue. So like from a standpoint of like, what do bodybuilders do to get jacked? Like they do a lot of repetitions, they do a lot of time under tension, they keep their rest periods short, and they also work to failure very, very often, right? Because what does working to failure do? Like what's physiologically what's happening? Jacob, I'm looking at you.
I'm trying to think. It's the good head bob while you wait on the answer. Training to failure, like what does it elicit? I mean, I guess you're depleting like ATP, you're depleting all of your resources to that muscle. So it's having to drive adaptation and like pull from its like last reserve energy stores, almost like, I guess, BFR in a sense. Like that's what BFR's whole goal is.